The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Revotech Industries as Elena Santos pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway. The scent of lemon cleaner hung in the air, mixing with the smell of expensive cologne and fresh coffee that always seemed to follow the executives around. Elena had been working as a janitor at the prestigious engineering firm for almost 8 months now, invisible to most of the employees who hurried past her with their eyes glued to phones and tablets. At 32, Elena wasn't where she had expected to be in life. Her small apartment across town was filled with engineering textbooks and half-finished sketches of machines that would probably never see the light of day. Life had thrown her some hard curves: her mother's illness, the mountain of medical bills, and then the recession that hit just as she graduated. But Elena wasn't one to complain. The janitorial job paid the bills, and sometimes, if she was lucky, she could glimpse the cutting-edge technology being developed behind the glass walls of the labs. Today was different, though. As Elena approached the main research lab, she could hear raised voices. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack she could see a tall man with salt and pepper hair pacing back and forth, his expensive suit jacket tossed carelessly over a chair. 3 months and $10 million, and this is what I get? The man's voice boomed through the room. Elena recognized him immediately. Richard Vaughn, the CEO of Revotech Industries, known for his brilliant mind and equally fierce temper. "Sir, the physics are challenging us at every turn," a nervous-looking engineer explained, gesturing toward a strange metallic contraption in the center of the room. "The thermal expansion issues alone are—" "I don't want excuses, I want results," Vaughn snapped, slamming his hand on a nearby desk. "The investors will be here in 3 days. 3 days. And you're telling me our revolutionary engine still doesn't work?" Elena couldn't help herself. She leaned closer, peering at the machine that had caused such a commotion. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. A combination of gears, pistons, and what looked like magnetic coils arranged in a pattern that defied conventional design, but something about it looked off to her trained eye. "The heat distribution is all wrong," she whispered to herself, not realizing she had spoken aloud until the room suddenly fell silent. Vaughn turned slowly, his piercing blue eyes finding her in the doorway. "What did you say?" Elena froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, let alone speak. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to interrupt." No, come in." Vaughn's voice was dangerously calm as he beckoned her forward. "Please, share your expertise with my team of highly paid engineers who apparently can't solve a simple thermal dynamics problem." The sarcasm in his voice made Elena wince, but she was already in trouble, so she cautiously wheeled her cart into the lab. 6 engineers stared at her, some looking embarrassed, others amused. "I was just passing by," Elena explained, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't mean to overhear." "But you did," Vaughn said, crossing his arms. "And you seem to think you know what's wrong with our engine, the same engine that has stumped some of the brightest minds in the country." Elena glanced at the machine again, then back at the CEO. She should apologize and leave. She knew that. But something about the challenge in his eyes sparked a fire she hadn't felt in years. "The heat isn't being properly channeled," she said, pointing to a section of the engine. "If the thermal expansion is causing problems, it's because the design is fighting against it rather than working with it." A tall woman with a sleek ponytail stepped forward, her expression cold. "And you know this how exactly?" "Diane, be nice," Vaughn said, though his own tone wasn't much warmer. "Our cleaning staff apparently has hidden talents." Elena felt her cheeks burn. She'd been in situations like this before, dismissed because of her job, her appearance, her lack of credentials. But the engine called to her. She could see the problem so clearly. "I just noticed things," she said simply, not wanting to reveal her background. That part of her life was behind her now, locked away with her dreams and ambitions. Vaughn studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then suddenly he laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. "Well, Elena," he said, reading her name tag, "since you notice things, why don't you take a crack at it?" The engineers exchanged glances, some smirking, others looking uncomfortable. "Sir?" The woman named Diane looked alarmed. "This is highly irregular. The engine contains proprietary technology." That doesn't work, Vaughn finished for her. What's the harm? If Elena here thinks she can fix what a team of MIT and Stanford graduates can't, I say let her try. Elena knew she should back down. This was a trap, a way for the powerful CEO to humiliate her and blow off some steam. But the challenge had awakened something in her, pride maybe, or the memory of the person she used to be, the one who tackled impossible problems for fun. I would need access to the lab, she said, surprising even herself with her boldness. And the technical specs. Vaughn's eyebrows shot up, and then he smiled, a predatory grin that didn't reach his eyes. Done. Diane will get you whatever you need. You have until Thursday morning before the investors arrive. Thursday? Elena's confidence wavered. That's only 3 days. Is that a problem? My engineers have had 3 months and failed. Surely a genius like you can manage in 3 days. His voice dripped with mockery. Elena looked at the engine again, her mind already racing through possibilities. This was crazy. She hadn't worked on anything like this in years, but the principles were there, waiting to be applied. And more. Importantly, she could see what they couldn't. Sometimes the solution wasn't about adding complexity, but about stripping it away. I'll need access after hours, she said. I still have my regular duties during the day. A flicker of surprise crossed Vaughn's face, quickly replaced by amusement. Of course, we wouldn't want the floors to go unwashed while you're saving my company. Some of the engineers laughed, but Elena hardly noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the engine, her fingers itching to get to work. Diane, get her set up with a badge and whatever else she needs, Vaughn said, already turning away, his interest in the conversation clearly waning. And someone brief her on the basics. I have a meeting. As the CEO strode out of the lab, Diane approached Elena, her expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. What kind of game are you playing? She asked quietly. No game, Elena replied, still staring at the engine. I just think I can help. Diane snorted. Right. Well, don't get too comfortable. Vaughn is just using you to light a fire under the team. He doesn't actually expect you to fix anything. I know, Elena said, finally looking away from the machine to meet Diane's gaze. But I'm going to try anyway. As Elena was led through the security protocols and paperwork, her heart raced with a mixture of excitement and terror. What had she gotten herself into? She had a small apartment to clean in the morning, 2 office buildings in the afternoon, and now, apparently, an impossible engine to fix at night. Back in her tiny locker in the janitorial closet, hidden under her spare uniform, was a worn leather case containing her most prized possession, her engineering degree from Caltech, earned through years of scholarships and night jobs. No one at Revotech knew about it. No one knew that before life's complications had derailed her career, Elena Santos had been on track to revolutionize mechanical engineering. As she wheeled her cart out of the lab, promising to return after her shift, Elena felt a strange sense of destiny. 3 days to prove herself, 3 days to reclaim a piece of the life she'd lost, 3 days to solve an impossible problem. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Elena's day passed in a blur of mop buckets, trash bags, and cleaning solutions. Her hands worked on autopilot while her mind raced through equations and design principles she hadn't used in years. By the time she clocked out from her regular janitorial duties, the sun had already set, casting the Revotech building in shadow. She stood outside the research lab, her new access badge feeling strange and heavy in her hand. Through the glass, she could see the impossible engine sitting in the center of the room, bathed in the glow of overhead lights. For a moment, doubt crept in. What was she thinking? These people had degrees hanging on their walls, current experience, and all the resources in the world. Who was she to think she could solve what they couldn't? Then she remembered the smirks, the dismissive glances, the way Vaughn had mockingly given her this chance, expecting her to fail. Elena swiped her badge and pushed open the door. If nothing else, she would try. The lab was eerily quiet at night. During the day, it buzzed with conversations, the clicking of keyboards, and the hum of various machines. Now it was just Elena and the engine. She approached it slowly, circling it like a cautious animal. Up close, it was even more impressive. a blend of traditional mechanics and cutting-edge technology. She found the specs Diane had reluctantly provided and spread them across a workstation. Okay, she whispered to herself. Let's see what we're dealing with. The first hour was spent simply understanding the engine's purpose. According to the documentation, it was designed to convert minimal energy input into substantial output, using principles that pushed the boundaries of physics. If it worked, it would revolutionize everything from transportation to power generation. The second hour, she focused on the thermal expansion issue that seemed to be the core problem. Every time the engine reached a certain temperature, the metals expanded in ways that caused critical misalignments. The engineers had tried cooling systems, heat-resistant alloys, and complex recalibration mechanisms, but nothing worked consistently. Elena tapped her pencil against her chin, staring at the engine. They're fighting physics, she murmured. But what if we work with it instead? She grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching, her hand moving faster than it had in years. What if the expansion itself could become part of the engine's function? What if, instead of trying to prevent it, they harnessed it? She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the lab door open. Finding everything you need? Elena jumped, her pencil clattering to the floor. Diane stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Yes, thank you, Elena said, bending to retrieve her pencil. I was just getting familiar with the design. Diane walked in, heels clicking sharply against the floor. At 2 a.m? Elena glanced at the clock, surprised. She hadn't realized how late it was. I work days, she explained. This is the only time I have. Diane approached the workstation, eyeing Elena's sketches. What's this? Just some ideas, Elena said, resisting the urge to cover her work. I think the problem is in the approach. Everyone's trying to fight the thermal expansion, but what if it's actually key to making the engine work? Diane raised an eyebrow. That contradicts every principle we've been working with. Sometimes contradictions lead to breakthroughs, Elena said quietly. Diane studied her for a long moment. You're not really a janitor, are you? Industrial spy? Competitor's plant? Elena laughed despite herself. No, I'm really a janitor. I clean 3 buildings and an apartment complex every week. Then how do you know about thermal expansion coefficients and magnetohydrodynamics? Diane pointed to some notations on Elena's paper. Elena hesitated. She had been careful not to reveal too much of her background, but Diane had caught her. I studied engineering in college, she admitted. Life happened. I never got to use my degree. Caltech, Diane said. Not a question, but a statement. Elena's head snapped up. How did you? I had you checked out after your little performance this morning, Diane said, unapologetic. Elena Santos, full scholarship, graduated with honors, published a paper on innovative approaches to thermal dynamics that was largely dismissed by the academic community as too theoretical. Heat rose to Elena's cheeks. That paper had been her pride and joy, the culmination of years of work, and its rejection had been a crushing blow right before her mother's diagnosis had forced her to abandon her career path. Why are you working as a janitor with credentials like that? Diane asked, genuine curiosity in her voice for the first time. Elena shrugged, uncomfortable with the question. Medical bills. Bad timing with the recession. Then a gap in my resume that grew too big to explain. After a while, it was easier to take what I could get. Diane seemed to digest this information, her eyes moving from Elena to the engine and back again. Your paper, she said finally. It was about using thermal expansion as a propulsion catalyst rather than an obstacle, wasn't it? Elena nodded, surprised that Diane had actually read it. I thought it was brilliant, Diane said. Unorthodox, but brilliant. You read my paper? Elena couldn't keep the shock from her voice. I read everything in our field, Diane said simply, even the papers that get unfairly dismissed. A moment of understanding passed between the two women. Then Diane straightened, professional mask back in place. Well, don't get your hopes up about fixing this thing, she said, gesturing to the engine. Vaughn's just playing games. Even if you did solve it, he'd find a way to take credit. I'm not doing it for him, Elena said. I'm doing it for me. Diane nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Good luck, then. You'll need it. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. The supply cabinet has energy drinks and protein bars. Help yourself. Sounds like you'll be pulling another late night tomorrow. After Diane left, Elena sat back in her chair, processing what had just happened. Was it possible she'd found an ally? Or was Diane playing her own game? Either way, Elena couldn't afford to waste time wondering. She had less than 3 days to prove herself. She turned back to her sketches, the excitement of the challenge pushing exhaustion away. By morning, she had filled 12 pages with calculations and redesign concepts. When the first engineers began arriving, they found her cleaning up her workspace, dark circles under her eyes but determination in her expression. "Any progress?" one of them asked, not bothering to hide his smirk. "Some," Elena replied, gathering her notes. "See you tonight." She left before they could question her further, hurrying to her locker to change for her day job. As she scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans throughout the day, her mind continued to work on the problem, refining her approach, identifying potential obstacles. By the time she returned to the lab that evening, she had a clear plan. She needed to modify 3 key components of the engine to work with the thermal expansion, rather than against it. The physics were sound. She had proven that in her paper years ago, but the application would be tricky. To her surprise, she found tools laid out on her workstation and a fresh pot of coffee nearby. On a sticky note was written, "Thought these might help." Elena smiled. Maybe she wasn't as alone in this as she'd thought. Rolling up her sleeves, she got to work. The night stretched ahead, full of possibilities. For the first time in years, she wasn't just Elena the janitor. She was Elena the engineer, doing what she was born to do. And somewhere deep inside, a flicker of hope ignited. Maybe, just maybe, this impossible challenge could be the key to reclaiming her dreams. The second night blended into the early hours of the morning as Elena worked tirelessly on the engine. Her fingers were stained with grease. Her back ached from bending over the complex machinery, but her mind was sharp and focused. This was the final night before the demonstration to the investors. Tomorrow would determine everything. Elena had made significant progress. Using principles from her old research paper, she had redesigned key components of the engine to work with thermal expansion rather than against it. The central chamber now had specially designed grooves that would channel the expanding metal into a configuration that actually enhanced performance. It was counterintuitive, but the math checked out. "Just one more adjustment," she muttered to herself, carefully tightening a connection deep within the engine's core. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. She had been working for nearly 7 hours straight after completing her janitorial shift. The lab door opened and Diane walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She had been making these late-night visits regularly now, bringing coffee and occasionally offering insights that helped Elena refine her approach. "You look like you're making progress," Diane said, setting one of the cups beside Elena's workspace. "Thanks," Elena said, taking a grateful sip. The coffee was strong and sweet, just how she liked it. "I think I've almost got it. The reconfigured thermal pathways should create a positive feedback loop once the engine reaches operating temperature." Diane studied the modified engine with a critical eye. "It's genius," she admitted, "but also completely against conventional wisdom. The engineering team is going to have a fit when they see what you've done." Elena shrugged. "Sometimes you have to break the rules to make a breakthrough. Vaughn isn't going to like that you've basically rebuilt his precious engine from the inside out," Diane warned. "He asked me to fix it." "He didn't specify how." Elena wiped her hands on a rag and took another drink of coffee. "Besides, I kept all the original parts. I just rearranged them." Diane laughed, a sound Elena had rarely heard from the usually serious executive. "Well, I can't wait to see their faces tomorrow." She hesitated, then added, "You know, if this works, it could change everything. Not just for the company, but for you." Elena nodded, allowing herself to imagine just for a moment a return to the life she had once dreamed of, a life where her mind was valued more than her ability to clean floors. But she had learned to be cautious with hope. "One step at a time," she said. "First, let's see if it works." They both turned as the lab door opened again. This time it was 2 members of the engineering team, looking surprised to find anyone else there so late. "What are you doing here?" The taller one, Pete, asked Diane. Then his eyes fell on Elena and the modified engine. "What's she doing to the engine?" The second engineer, Luis, hurried forward. "Wait, you can't just take apart company property. That's months of work." Diane stepped between them and the engine. "She has authorization from Vaughn himself, as you well know." And I'm here as the company's representative to oversee her work. Pete scowled. This is ridiculous. She's a janitor. With a degree from Caltech and a published paper on thermal dynamics, Diane replied coolly. Perhaps if you'd spent more time researching solutions and less time dismissing them, based on who proposed them, you wouldn't be in this position. The engineers exchanged glances, clearly not having expected Diane to defend Elena. We came in to run some final diagnostics before tomorrow, Louis said, his tone slightly more respectful now. The investors will be here at 10. We'll be done soon, Elena said, turning back to the engine. She didn't have time for office politics. The modified components were in place. Now she needed to run her own diagnostics to ensure everything was properly aligned. The engineers hovered uncomfortably for a few minutes, then retreated to a workstation on the far side of the lab, occasionally casting suspicious glances in Elena's direction. Don't mind them, Diane murmured. They're just worried about their jobs. Elena nodded, focusing on her work. She connected the diagnostic equipment and began running tests, watching as data flowed across the screen. Everything looked good in theory, but the true test would be powering up the engine. I think it's ready, she said finally, straightening up. Her back protested after hours bent over the machinery. You want to test it now? Diane asked, glancing at the engineers who were now watching with undisguised interest. Elena nodded. Better to find out now if there are any issues than in front of the investors tomorrow. Taking a deep breath, she initiated the startup sequence. The engine hummed to life, a soft vibration that gradually increased in intensity. Lights on the control panel flickered on, readings beginning to climb. Temperature rising, Diane noted, watching the monitors, approaching the critical point where it usually fails. The engineers had abandoned any pretense of working and were now openly staring at the engine. Pete had his phone out, likely ready to call Vaughn if something went wrong. Elena watched the temperature gauge climb steadily. This was the moment of truth. If her modifications worked, the thermal expansion would actually enhance the engine's performance rather than causing it to fail. The temperature passed the critical point. For a moment, the engine's vibration increased and Elena held her breath. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of the grinding halt that had plagued previous tests, the engine's hum deepened, stabilized. The output readings began to climb steadily. It's working, Diane whispered, eyes wide. The engine was now running more efficiently than it ever had before. The temperature had stabilized, and the power output was climbing far beyond what the original design had achieved. The lab door burst open. Vaughn stood there in a rumpled suit, as if he'd dressed in a hurry. Behind him were several other executives and engineers, all looking either concerned or excited. What's going on? Vaughn demanded. I got a call that someone was tampering with the engine. His eyes fell on Elena standing beside the humming engine, then moved to the readouts on the monitors. Disbelief crossed his face. Is it working? Yes, sir, Diane said, a hint of pride in her voice. Elena's modifications have solved the thermal expansion issue. The engine is not only operational but exceeding expected performance metrics. Vaughn approached slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might cause the miracle before him to vanish. He studied the engine, then the readouts, then finally turned to Elena. How? The single word contained a mix of emotions: surprise, confusion, and reluctant admiration. Instead of fighting the thermal expansion, I redesigned the internal components to harness it, Elena explained. The heat actually improves efficiency once it's properly channeled. Vaughn looked at the engine again, then at the group of engineers who had called him. You said she was destroying company property. Pete had the grace to look embarrassed. She was taking it apart, and she's just a brilliant engineer who solved what none of you could, Vaughn finished for him. He turned back to Elena, studying her with new eyes. Why are you working as a janitor with this kind of mind? Elena met his gaze steadily. Life doesn't always go as planned, Mr. Vaughn. Sometimes you have to take whatever path is available to you. A moment of understanding passed between them. Then Vaughn straightened, his business persona sliding back into place. Well, it seems I underestimated you, Elena. I owe you an apology for that. He glanced at his watch. The investors will be here in 6 hours. I want everything perfect for the demonstration. As the room buzzed with activity, engineers examining Elena's modifications with newfound respect, Diane pulled her aside. You did it, she said quietly. I knew you could. Elena smiled, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the adrenaline was wearing off. I should go. My morning shift at the apartment building starts in an hour. Diane shook her head in disbelief. You just revolutionized engine technology and you're worried about your cleaning schedule? Bills don't pay themselves, Elena said with a small shrug. I'll be back for the demonstration. As she gathered her things to leave, Vaughn approached her again. Elena, wait. We need to talk about your future at Revotech. Elena paused, her heart suddenly racing faster than when she had started the engine. My future? Yes, Vaughn said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. I believe it just got a lot brighter. Elena didn't go to her morning cleaning job. After a brief call to her supervisor explaining she had a family emergency, she found herself sitting in Richard Vaughn's spacious office, still wearing her work clothes from the night before. The contrast between her worn jeans and faded t-shirt and the gleaming glass and chrome office couldn't have been more stark. Vaughn sat across from her, tie loosened, looking as tired as she felt. Between them on the polished desk was a contract. So let me make sure I understand, Elena said, struggling to keep her voice steady. You're offering me a position as a senior engineer? Vaughn nodded. With a starting salary of $150,000 stock options and full benefits. He leaned forward. Elena, what you did with that engine is nothing short of revolutionary. The applications go far beyond what we initially imagined. Elena's mind was spinning. Just yesterday she had been invisible to this man. Just another person who cleaned his company while he went about his important business. Now he was looking at her like she was the answer to all his problems. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say yes, Vaughn replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We can have you moved out of janitorial services today. New office, new badge, new everything. Something in his tone made Elena hesitate. And the engine? My design? Will be presented to the investors as Revotech's latest breakthrough, Vaughn said smoothly. I'll personally acknowledge your contribution, of course. A true rags to riches story. The janitor who became an engineer overnight. The press will eat it up. Elena studied him. But the design remains company property. Naturally. You created it while using company resources, even if it was after hours. He slid the contract closer to her. This is standard for all our engineers. Your name will be on the patents as part of the team. Part of the team, Elena repeated, the words tasting strange. Not the primary inventor. Vaughn's smile tightened slightly. Elena, let's be practical. Yes, you had the breakthrough. But this was a team effort. Months of work went into that engine before you ever touched it. Months of work that led nowhere until I applied principles from my own research, Elena pointed out. Research I did years before I ever stepped foot in Revotech. Vaughn's expression hardened. Research that was rejected by the scientific community and would have remained gathering dust if not for the opportunity I gave you. The door opened before Elena could respond, and Diane walked in, tablet in hand. She glanced between them, clearly sensing the tension. The investors will be here in 2 hours, she said. The lab team is running final checks on the engine now. Excellent, Vaughn said, his business smile returning. Elena and I were just finalizing her new position with the company. He looked pointedly at the unsigned contract. Diane raised an eyebrow at Elena, who gave a small shake of her head. Actually, Diane said, I need to borrow Elena for a moment. There's something about the engine calibration that only she understands. Vaughn looked annoyed but nodded. Fine, but make it quick. I want this contract signed before the investors arrive. In the hallway, Diane led Elena to a small conference room and closed the door. You're not signing? She asked without preamble. Elena sighed. I don't know. It's a good offer. Life-changing money, but he's trying to minimize your contribution and claim the glory. Diane finished for her. Something like that. Elena ran a hand through her hair. Is that how it always works here? Diane leaned against the table. Usually, Vaughn didn't get where he is by sharing credit. What would you do? Elena asked. Diane was quiet for a moment. I'd remember that right now. You hold all the cards. That engine doesn't work without your modifications, and the investors arrive in less than 2 hours. Elena's eyes widened slightly as she understood what Diane was suggesting. You think I should negotiate? I think you should know your worth, Diane corrected. And I think Vaughn needs to learn that good ideas can come from anywhere, even the cleaning staff. Elena nodded slowly. a plan forming in her mind. I need to make a phone call. 90 minutes later, Elena stood in the lab watching as engineers made final preparations for the demonstration. The engine hummed perfectly, its output reading steady and impressive. She had changed into clothes Diane had lent her, a simple but professional blouse and slacks that fit surprisingly well. Vaughn strode in looking annoyed. There you are. The investors are on their way up and you still haven't signed the contract. I had some questions about the terms, Elena said calmly, particularly regarding patent attribution and creative ownership. Vaughn's jaw tightened. This isn't the time, Elena. We can discuss details after the demonstration. Actually, I think this is exactly the time, came a new voice. A tall woman with gray-streaked hair walked into the lab, radiating authority. Elena Santos? I'm Patricia Lynn from Lynn & Associates Patent Law. Vaughn looked between them in confusion. What is this? Ms. Lynn is an old friend of my college advisor, Elena explained. She very kindly agreed to look over your contract on short notice. And I have some concerns, Patricia said, opening her briefcase. Particularly about how Ms. Santos's prior research is being integrated into company property, without proper attribution or compensation. Vaughn's face flushed. This is completely inappropriate. The investors will be here any minute. Yes, they will, Elena agreed, and they'll be very interested in seeing the engine work. The engine that only works because of my modifications. The threat hung in the air between them. Vaughn looked at the engine, then at Elena, understanding dawning in his eyes. You wouldn't. I wouldn't what? Insist on fair recognition for my work? Elena met his gaze steadily. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, Mr. Vaughn, just what I've earned. Before Vaughn could respond, Diane appeared at the door. The investors are here, she announced, her eyes flicking between Elena and Vaughn with interest. Vaughn straightened his tie, clearly weighing his options. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. What do you want? He finally asked Elena, his voice low and urgent. Primary inventor credit on the patent, she replied without hesitation. A fair royalty on applications of my thermal expansion principles. And a director-level position, not senior engineer. Vaughn's eyes narrowed. That's outrageous. It's market value for someone who just solved your company's biggest technical challenge, Patricia interjected smoothly. In fact, I'd argue it's quite reasonable. The sound of voices approaching the lab made Vaughn's decision more urgent. He looked at the engine, then back at Elena. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. Patricia can work out the details with our legal team. But right now we have investors to impress. He turned to Elena, his expression a forced smile. And you, Director Santos, are going to help me do that. As the investors filed into the lab, men and women in expensive suits with calculating eyes, Vaughn transformed into the confident CEO, welcoming them with practiced charm. He gestured to the engine, proudly announcing that Revotech had achieved a breakthrough. And it's all thanks to our newest team member, Director Elena Santos, he said, placing a hand on Elena's shoulder that felt both congratulatory and slightly threatening. Elena, why don't you explain to our guests how your innovative approach solved our thermal expansion issues? Elena stepped forward, feeling strange in her borrowed clothes, addressing a room of powerful people who just days ago wouldn't have given her a second glance. But as she began to explain her design, her confidence grew. This was her element, the world she had trained for, the place her mind had always belonged. The investors were clearly impressed, asking intelligent questions that Elena answered with growing assurance. One older gentleman, the CEO of a major energy company, couldn't contain his enthusiasm. This changes everything, he declared. The applications for clean energy alone are staggering. As the demonstration continued successfully, Elena caught Diane's eye across the room. The executive gave her a subtle nod of approval. Whatever happened next, Elena had proven herself. Her days of invisibility were over. Later, as the investors mingled with champagne glasses in hand, celebrating what would surely be a lucrative partnership, Vaughn pulled Elena aside. You drove a hard bargain, he said quietly. I underestimated you again. It seems to be a pattern, Elena replied. Vaughn studied her for a moment, then surprisingly, a genuine smile broke through. Well, Director Santos, welcome to the executive team. I have a feeling you're going to keep us all on our toes. As Elena accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, she couldn't help but reflect on how quickly life could change. 3 days ago, she had been cleaning these floors. Now she was standing on them as an equal to the people who had once looked through her. But even as she savored her triumph, a question nagged at her. How many other Elenas were out there? Brilliant minds trapped in invisible roles just waiting for their chance to shine. 3 months passed in a whirlwind of changes for Elena. Her small apartment was now filled with engineering journals instead of cleaning supplies. Her hands, once rough from industrial cleaning solutions, were now calloused from working with tools in Revotech's expanded research lab, and her mind, which had been quietly starving for years, now feasted daily on the complex problems she was born to solve. The transition hadn't been easy. Some of the engineers who had watched her clean their offices for months couldn't adjust to seeing her as their director. They questioned her decisions, challenged her authority, and sometimes flat out ignored her instructions. But Elena had faced harder challenges. With quiet confidence and undeniable results, she gradually earned their respect, if not their friendship. Today was a big day. Revotech was unveiling the commercial prototype of what they now called the Santos engine. Elena stood backstage at the tech conference, watching through a gap in the curtains as Vaughn warmed up the crowd of industry leaders, journalists, and potential investors. Nervous, Diane appeared beside her, elegant as always in a tailored suit. A little, Elena admitted. I'm not used to being in the spotlight. Well, get used to it, Diane said with a smile. The world wants to know about the janitor who revolutionized engine technology. Elena made a face. Is that going to be my title forever? The janitor who? Only if you let it define you, Diane replied. From where I stand, you're the engineer who changed everything. Their conversation was interrupted by applause from the audience. Vaughn was gesturing toward the side of the stage. And now, I'd like to introduce the brilliant mind behind our breakthrough technology, Revotech's Director of Innovation, Elena Santos. Taking a deep breath, Elena walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience a blur of faces. 3 months ago, the idea of speaking to a crowd like this would have terrified her. Now it was just another challenge to overcome. Thank you, she said into the microphone, her voice steadier than she felt. As many of you have heard, my journey to this stage was unconventional. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Her story had become something of a legend in the tech world. The hidden genius discovered cleaning floors. But what matters isn't how I got here, she continued. What matters is what we've created and what it means for the future. She launched into an explanation of the Santos engine, describing how it used thermal expansion to enhance efficiency, rather than fighting against it. As she spoke, her initial nervousness faded. This was her element, explaining complex ideas in ways that made them accessible, sharing her passion for innovation. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions that Elena answered with growing confidence. When the presentation concluded, the applause was thunderous. Journalists swarmed the stage, cameras flashing, questions flying from all directions. Hours later, exhausted but exhilarated, Elena finally escaped to a quiet corner of the hotel bar. The conference would continue for 2 more days, but her major presentation was done. She sipped a celebratory glass of wine, scrolling through messages on her new phone. Congratulations from former professors who had seen her on the live stream, an excited text from her mother, who had watched from her nursing home, and dozens of emails from young women in STEM fields calling her an inspiration. That last part still felt strange. Elena had never set out to be a role model. She had just been trying to survive, to use her mind again, to prove herself. But her story had resonated far beyond what she could have imagined. There she is, the woman of the hour. Elena looked up to see Vaughn approaching, drink in hand. Their relationship had evolved into something approaching mutual respect, though there was still an edge of competition between them. Mind if I join you? He asked, already pulling out a chair. It's your company's event, Elena replied with a small smile. Vaughn settled across from her, studying her over the rim of his glass. You did well today. The investors are practically throwing money at us. Good. We'll need it for the expansion project. After the initial success of the engine, Elena had proposed an ambitious research division focused on finding other applications for her thermal expansion principles. Vaughn had been hesitant about the cost, but the potential returns were too great to ignore. About that, Vaughn said, setting down his glass. The board has some concerns. Elena felt a familiar tension creep into her shoulders. What kind of concerns? They think the hiring criteria for your new division are Unusual. He cleared his throat. Specifically, your insistence on interviewing maintenance staff, service workers, and others without traditional engineering backgrounds. I want people with diverse perspectives and problem-solving skills, Elena said firmly. People who might have taken unconventional paths like me. People without proper credentials, Vaughn countered. People who might have been overlooked, Elena corrected. Do you really want to have this argument again, Richard? After what I've proven? Vaughn had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. You're exceptional, Elena, a 1 in a million mind. But we can't build a research division on the hope of finding more hidden janitor geniuses. Elena leaned forward. That's exactly what I intend to do. Not just janitors, but food service workers, retail employees, people who had to abandon their education for family obligations or financial hardship. Her voice grew passionate. Do you have any idea how much talent is wasted because opportunities only go to people who fit a certain mold? Before Vaughn could respond, they were interrupted by a young man in a hotel uniform, collecting empty glasses from nearby tables. He paused, recognition flashing across his face. Sorry to interrupt, he said hesitantly. But are you Elena Santos? From the tech presentation today? Elena nodded, smiling. That's me. I watched it on my break, he said, his eyes lighting up. The way you talked about thermal expansion and energy conversion, it was amazing. I've been working on something similar for a home heating system, but I never thought about applying it the way you did. Elena's interest was immediately piqued. You're an engineer? The young man looked down at his uniform and laughed softly. Not officially. I had to drop out of my mechanical engineering program when my dad got sick, but I still tinker in my garage. He seemed to remember himself then, embarrassed. Sorry for bothering you. I just wanted to say your work is brilliant. As he turned to leave, Elena exchanged a pointed look with Vaughn. Wait, she called after the young man. I'd love to hear more about your heating system design. Do you have time for a chat when your shift ends? His eyes widened in surprise. Really? I mean, yes, absolutely. After he left, promising to return later, Elena turned back to Vaughn with a raised eyebrow. Still think my hiring criteria are a waste of time? Vaughn shook his head, a reluctant smile forming. Point taken. But the board will still need convincing. Then let me convince them, Elena said. Give me 6 months to prove that my approach works. If my diverse team doesn't deliver results, we can go back to hiring only MIT graduates. Vaughn considered this, then nodded slowly. 6 months. But I want regular progress reports, and if things aren't working, they will, Elena interrupted with quiet confidence. You took a chance on a janitor once. It paid off pretty well, as I recall. The next morning, Elena stood in the gleaming lobby of Revotech's headquarters, watching as a group of nervous-looking people were escorted through security. There was Miguel, the hotel worker from last night. Lisa, a former teacher who had written to Elena about her ideas for educational applications of the engine technology. Hero, a delivery driver with a self-taught background in computer modeling, and several others, 15 in total, each with unconventional backgrounds and brilliant untapped potential. Diane appeared beside Elena, surveying the group with interest. Your new team? The first wave, Elena confirmed. There are hundreds more applications to review. Vaughn is taking a big risk on this, Diane noted. No, Elena said, smiling as she stepped forward to greet her new team. He's making the smartest investment of his career. He just doesn't know it yet. As she welcomed the group and led them toward the elevator, Elena caught sight of a woman pushing a cleaning cart down the hallway. Their eyes met briefly, and Elena gave her a respectful nod. The woman looked surprised, then smiled and nodded back. In that small exchange was everything Elena had been fighting for. Recognition, respect. The acknowledgement that worth wasn't determined by uniform or title. As the elevator doors closed on her new team, Elena felt a profound sense of having come full circle. 3 months ago, she had been given a chance to prove herself. Now she was holding the door open for others. The Santos engine had revolutionized energy technology, but Elena's greater revolution was just beginning. A world where genius could be found and nurtured wherever it grew, even in the most unexpected places. And it had all started with a CEO's dismissive challenge to a janitor he had badly underestimated.